Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Lecture 8 of English 1120, Time and History. In literature, tonight we're going to cover a first part of a couple of lectures on John Milton's Paradise Lost, and I'm looking forward to that. I hope everyone is. I hope everyone had a chance to start some of the reading of this, and we can go over that tonight. We'll probably mostly concentrate on beginning to look at book one, as well as the context, a little bit of the historical background, poetic background of Milton's great epic. So this is the work upon which you'll be doing your research paper that we discussed last week. We discussed what should be expected for that research paper, so keep that in mind as you're reading or as you're listening to the lectures about the work. I want to also just signal everyone to try to give it a good shot on the reading. I know as with Shakespeare, to some extent, the language can be, we're reading for the first time with Shakespeare and now with Milton, works that have not been translated. So before, the other works were either in Greek or Latin or Old English and were translated into modern English. Here we're dealing with early modern English that's a little bit foreign. The syntax can be foreign. The word choices can be somewhat foreign. Do give it a shot. Try to just read over it. Try to, my advice would be not to get caught up on individual words, but try to get a general sense of what's happening. And then you can go back on a second reading and try to pick out individual words. So just before we get started, maybe through a show of hands, I could get a sense of who has encountered this poem previous to this class. Anyone read sections of it in another course or in high school? So I'm not seeing any hands as of yet. So no hands. So this is the first time. And did people, again, show of hands, honestly, did anyone have a chance to do the readings for tonight, at least elements of book one or book two? I want to get a sense of how explanatory this lecture should be.
I read them, but I didn't quite understand them, so I have to go over them again and read them again.
Okay, so who was speaking there? Isabel, thanks, Isabel. So Isabel admitted to, well, said she'd read it, but not sure exactly to what extent she got anything meaningful out of it. Have to go back, and that's definitely what happened. I know when I read it the first time in undergrad as well. So you're in company with, I think, everyone who read it. So hopefully this lecture can give some guidance. It's rightfully famous and kind of intimidating work. It's this giant work within the English canon that stands there, and every poet or every literary author afterwards, in some way or other, ends up referring to Milton and in trying to deal with Milton's work and trying to figure out how they can be original. I'll come back to this a number of times. In a sense, he's said all things. He's told the story of all things. So what room is there left for creativity for these other authors afterwards? He's told the story of all time, of within the Christian framework of the fall of humanity, that as well as the upcoming history of humanity after that is prophesied, the ultimate judgment and the end of days. He's talked about creation. He's talked about philosophical issues around free will. So there's it's a mammoth work in that sense. It's also a problematic work. It's in terms of polar extremes of interpretation of how we were supposed to, differing opinions in terms of how we're supposed to take this work, both in terms of its quality, that the quality, is it the greatest work, or is it just too long and a waste of time? There's a few people who would posit that, not as many, but then most importantly, the big question the biggest question is around the question of what is the overall message, let us say religious political message of the poem with respect to God and to rightful political authority? Are we meant to take away from the poem a satanic view that any kind of supreme authority we should assert ourselves against it and assert some sort of republican almost liberty against the eternal monarch God, as well as in terms of our own political affairs, assert republican liberty against political monarchs? Is that the message, or is the message one of kind of a more of an orthodox message of due obedience to the divine? And in terms of political perspective, that can be a bit more complicated. Milton in his own life was definitely a Republican, but how does that translate in this poem? So is political republicanism still fine, the assertion of liberty in the political realm, but when it comes to religious matters, one should have one's liberty directed to an ultimate goal? So these are the types of questions that guide Paradise Lost. So the title refers to, of course, the subject matter being the creation and the creation story and fall of Adam and Eve in Genesis. Okay, so in chapters 2 and 3 of Genesis. So there's so famous story. I won't go over all the details as described in Genesis. You can read that or reread that for yourselves if it's a little vague to you. But of course, there's a serpent that in Genesis that tempts Eve to eat a forbidden fruit of knowledge of good and evil. And this action, of course, let me back up there. Adam and Eve are the first humans, according to the myth, and they're in this Garden of Eden that is a type of paradise. Everything is provided for them with only one restriction, that they're not to eat from this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They're tempted by this serpent, they do eat. And thus begins post-lapsarian or post-fallen human history. So the rest of the Bible and the rest of human history, according to that Judeo-Christian framework, is post-lapsarian, post-fall. And our post-fallen existence is one in which we see things such as restrictions as restrictions. We see things as tempting. We see physical attainment as the only goals, etc. Whereas in a pre-lapsarian or pre-fallen existence, these would not necessarily be the ways that we would look at these things. And this is part of Milton's, and that's kind of a Freudian slip there, Satan, Milton. They will hopefully have a chance to talk about to what extent Milton's, the audacious task that Milton takes on in this poem is akin to maybe the audacious attempts to over assert that Satan performs in the poem. Okay, so there's a lot of parallels in the way the poetic task is described. So Milton's poetic task, the way that's described in the poem, as well as there's similarities between that and the way Satan's attempt to usurp the heavenly throne is described. So one of Milton's tasks is to try to describe this pre-lapsarian state. So what is it like to be unfallen? So we'll probably not have time to talk about that too much. We'll probably mostly focus on books 1 and 2 in the next 2 lectures. I'll hint towards what happens in books 4 and 9, which you're also supposed to read, okay, for next week. But we won't have as much time to go through those in detail, I imagine. So that's the general topic about this fall of humanity tempted by the serpent. The serpent in later tradition became associated with Satan, this figure of Satan. in the Bible, it's just in Genesis, it's just the serpent. So this with no association to this to Satan. Now, so the subject matter is this temptation and fall. Of course, the work begins, as epics do, in the midst of things, in the middle of things, and then goes back and tells the story of creation and projects forward the history of humanity. The climax occurs after after that middle of things and the fall, and then gives a prophesying future of what's going to happen to the history of humanity. So think about the prophecy, the way prophecy works in the other the other epics we read. So we read book 11 of the Odyssey there, and how prophecy interacts with narrative. So narrative, the prophecy is narrated, and it's a possible future for Odysseus, but as narrated, it's already happened. So it's prophecy as narrated becomes fate. Remember, we had that little formula almost. Then with Virgil, the prophecy that Aeneas encounters in book 6 in the underworld is provided by his father Anchises, and it's a pageant of future great rulers and leaders of Rome. And so we see prophecy as historical destiny of a particular people, of, in this case, Rome, and Rome as kind of as a chosen people that to bring peace on earth, and to rule their little slice of the earth. In Milton, we get a prophecy that looks both back and forward in terms of the cosmos as a whole and humanity as a whole. So it's universal. So that's the key point I want to make, is that of the distinction between this epic in terms of its relation to history and time and prophecy, are themes of this course, and the previous epics. So the previous epics had to do with either an individual, Odysseus, they had to do with a particular people, Rome. Milton's has to do with humanity and the cosmos. Okay, so it's the story of all things, story of all time. At this point, I think I'll pull up the PowerPoint to help guide the discussion and give you some visuals to follow the argument along here. So this is a reminder of where we are. We're looking right here. Milton and Shakespeare, kind of the high point of the literary renaissance for England. We just talked about our themes of our course: time, history, and narrative. I just made this point about the 3 different perspectives of our epics. So the epic descent in the Odyssey, the Aeneid, and Paradise Lost. Obviously, the other thing to point out there too is Paradise Lost is consciously pointing back to these epics, and one of the key story points that's being repeated here, except in a, say, magnified way, is this notion of a descent into the underworld. So you get these descents into the underworld in the Odyssey and in the Aeneid, but they're momentary, right? They're usually in the middle, and they occur for a portion of one book, right, as opposed to the whole. So we get several books in the underworld of Milton, right, in hell. Okay, so one of the, what you could say, one of the oxymorons that we encounter in book 1 is the narrator's describing scenes in hell, and he says the flames from the sulfur surface are emitting these blue flames, but it's not, the flames don't illuminate anything. So he's trying to picture hell as being so dark and so hellish that even the flames of this burning landscape don't emit light, right? So all it does is reveal scenes of darkness visible. Okay, so it's this famous expression, darkness visible. So in a way, Milton's, what he's doing in the work is try to expand on what occurs in the other works, in terms of revealing the underworld, revealing what this kind of landscape is like, by making darkness visible and expanding on that. So one thing to remember here too is the underworld in all these epics is spiritual and psychological, as opposed to, it operates on a number of levels. So it operates on the level of the story. The hero is going to the underworld. There's a function to perform there. The hero gets information. So it helps the story along in a literal sense. But it's also, to some extent, an encounter psychologically. So Odysseus is some ways prepared for the future. So same with Aeneas, it prepares him and recommits him to a futural founding destiny of Rome. For Milton, and for, like, I would say most writers probably after Dante, we didn't read Dante, but also a famous description of hell in the Inferno. The notion of the psychological encounter becomes one of going into the depths of and darkness within oneself, or at least the human capacity for darkness and evil, and trying to come out again with a positive, so to speak. So trying to come out again with being redirected towards the divine, towards the good. Okay, so recognizing, looking inward to see that, yes, there is a certain evil there. There's a satanic element to oneself, to a human. And there is a human proclivity to those types of actions, those types of desires. However, we need to face that, encounter it, in order to, let's say, embolden us to be redirected towards the good and the divine. So some preliminary questions. These were the questions I opened with. I think I've opened. I've revealed my cards on the first question. I think it's probably the greatest single literary work in English. I think Shakespeare is probably the greatest author in English in terms of the volume of great works. But when it comes to one singular work, I turn to this one as being kind of a center of gravity of the whole Western canon. And then Samuel Johnson, famously on the other side of it. So Samuel Johnson was an 18th century author and critic, famous in his own right, said, "None ever wished it longer than it is. Its perusal is a duty rather than a pleasure." So maybe some of you are thinking that, I had to read it for class, but, it was a duty rather than a pleasure. But, that comes with time, give it time. And then, is it a sublime, then the other maybe more profound question, is it a sublime justification of God? And as I said, being directed towards a higher purpose, or is it a celebration of the energy and the temptation of the satanic? Okay. So what is Paradise Lost? So the poem can be read as a biblical epic, as spiritual narrative, as autobiographical journey. As biblical epic, it's telling the story of humanity's fall, as I mentioned, and it tells this story of all things. Northrop Fife, famous literary critic, famous Canadian literary critic, calls it the story of all things. And then I would add that also the story of all time, in the way I described, from before the creation to the end of existence. Then So without further ado, maybe we should turn to the opening lines. I'll try to bring those up on the screen. Okay. So this is the online version that I've given you as a link in your in the syllabus and on the website. Okay, so this is a fairly good edition online. I haven't read through it on the online edition. I'll be using my hefty Milton here to read because I just prefer books in my old-fashioned way. But um, you should have everything you need here. There's notes that have been linked here that the ones I've seen I find fairly useful. As I said, what my recommendation would be to go through, forget the notes for the first go around and just try to get a sense of the overall flow. Okay, so what's he talking about just on a very, on the highest level? There's also these arguments. I won't start here, but there's these prose, what he calls arguments, which are summaries of what's going to happen in that book. So each book is like a chapter of the poem, just like the books of the Aeneid, right? So these are the opening lines. Remember the opening lines of our other epics we looked at. So Virgil, of arms and a man I sing. So alma virumque cano, so in Latin. So of arms and of a man. So one man. So and then arms referred to the rage of Achilles, and man referred to the opening line of the Odyssey, right? So the Odyssey starts with, of the man of many turns, I want to sing, So there it's the man of one man, Odysseus, who is a man of many twists and turns and very wily, right? So both those epics begin with man in the singular, okay? Here it's of man's, and think here, of humanity, obviously. So this is a kind of a older, before our more politically correct age would correct that to humanity's age, of humanity's first disobedience, of man's first disobedience. So already, remember this notion of Milton's epic as universal, okay? So already the hero here is in a sense has gone from the singular heroic individual to humanity's plight, okay? And humanity's struggle is the heroic struggle, okay, of humanity, or of man's first disobedience. And the first means there's many others, right? So of humanity's first disobedience, but I could tell you about the second or the third, and it's happening all the time. You are being disobedient, you're falling all the time, and that's part of your heroic struggle, humanity's heroic struggle that needs to be told. Of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree. So the fruit has a couple of references there. So the fruit of the forbidden tree. So they were tempted by the serpent to eat that fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But fruit could also be the outcome. So the outcome, a key part of the story is our fallenness, the act of disobedience that makes us fallen, and the outcome, the fruit, the ensuing product, so to speak, of those actions of disobedience, of that forbidden tree whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe. So only after eating the forbidden tree did humanity know death. So we would have been immortal in the Garden of Eden. We had access in the Garden of Eden, according to those chapters in Genesis, to the tree of life that provided immortality. So after that, God says there's a reference to kind of a council of gods there that God's referring to, and says we must, and now it's time to kick the humans out of the garden, lest they continue to eat from the tree of life and become as us. Okay, so they'd be immortal and know good and evil. So they'd be like gods. Okay, so we're kicked out of the garden, and death is brought into the world because of this first disobedience. Okay, and the the ongoing disobedience is part of this experience of being, is the fruit, let's say, the outcome of that first disobedience, our ongoing fallenness, our ongoing disobedience, our ongoing woe, and our ongoing death. So death as this being separated from the life and the light that is God, so to speak. With loss of Eden till one greater man. So I think the note will probably guide you to Christ there in some way. So one greater man. I won't read the whole note, but Jesus as a second Adam who corrects this fall. Okay. Restore us and regain the blissful seat. Sing, heavenly muse. So of all that, sing, heavenly muse, that on the secret top of Oreb, or of Sinai, didst inspire that shepherd. So the other muse, the other invocations of the muse for in Homer and Virgil, so recall those invocations were somewhat indiscriminate. So there was, sing, O muse. So there's 9 muses in the Greek mythological framework of muses. Maybe it's kind of a generic muse, that kind of thing. Here, Milton wants to bring in different ways of thinking about this from a Christian, Judeo-Christian perspective that he's going to say encapsulates that and transcends that classical notion. Okay, sing, heavenly muse, that on the secret top of Horeb, so Mount Horeb, at the mount, one of the mountains in the Old Testament that Moses communed with God, or of Sinai, the other, didst inspire that shepherd, Moses, who first taught the chosen seed in the beginning how the heavens and earth rose out of chaos. So according to that tradition, Moses was inspired to write the first 5 books, the Pentateuch or Torah of the Hebrew Bible. So he was inspired, kind of like a poet, to write these books that covered creation and the fall, etc. How the heavens and earth rose out of chaos, or if Sion Hill delight thee more. So Sion Hill is a reference to Zion, a hill in Jerusalem, and a site of prophetic, so inspiration for prophets such as, I'm assuming this note will say Isaiah, I think. It doesn't refer to Isaiah, but Isaiah would be one of the prophetic figures that gets prophecy at this hill to see the future, let's say. Okay, so Moses in this biblical tradition is inspired to write the story of creation and human history up until that point. And then there's also a prophetic tradition of being inspired, a prophetic tradition in the Hebrew Bible of being inspired to see the future. So there's already in the invocation a couple of things that are slightly different than what we see in the Virgil that we looked at. So the Virgil, for instance, was a generic muse. Here it's more specific references to particular elements of the Bible. Okay, so there was a certain inspiration that happened here and they did this, or this type of inspiration that helped prophets. Give me that. It also has to do with time in both directions. It's makes explicit reference to be telling of the past or of the future. Or if Sion Hill delight thee more, and Siloa's brook that flowed fast past the oracle of God, I thence invoke thy aid to my adventurous song. So this is an adventurous song because it's adventurous in terms of the scope that Milton's trying to take on. That with no middle flight. So the middle flight would be a lower flight that the classical poets were able to go by through their inspiration, through the muses of Mount Parnassus and those classical haunts of the Greek muses. Here, this is a much higher transcendent flight to, let's say, these Christian truths that were not available to the classic poets. Sorry, where was I? Invoke thy aid to my adventurous song that with no middle flight intends to soar above the Aeonian mount, while it pursues things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. So that's the first 16 lines. There's famous 16 lines. In fact, the first 26 lines are famous, and often back in the old days, before me, even I wasn't forced to do this, but people would be called upon to memorize the first 26 lines in high school or university. So we didn't have that kind of regimen. So the things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. So Milton's a studier of language, studies words. He knows words, and he had spent, by the time he wrote the poem, we'll hopefully have a chance to, and if we don't have a chance to discuss it in class, it's in the lecture notes, a little bit of his background, how he studied profusely to try to be ready to be a poet. He felt if he was going to write this epic, that it was a big responsibility. So he spent years. He's supported by his father, so he didn't have other duties. He spent years studying classical literature, Hebrew literature, biblical scholarship, philosophy. By the time he's writing this poem, he was unmistakably the most educated, most well-read individual in England at the time. So who has this vast knowledge at his fingertips, and he's part of that knowledge is a vast knowledge of languages: Hebrew, Latin, Aramaic, Greek, etc. It was all at his fingertips, and he's reading these works in the originals, including Middle English and the roots of these words. And he knows that things unattempted are tempting. So he knows that there's an etymological link between tempt and things that are you're going to attempt, I'm going to try, and things that are tempting, that want you to try them. So Milton is, let's say, tempted by the fact that these lofty heights of trying to explain in poetic language biblical truths of the divine, of all of existence, haven't yet been tried, and it's out there for a poetic imagination to take on. And this is tempting, so to speak, and it has not yet been attempted in prose or rhyme by other authors. And chiefly thou, O spirit, that dost prefer before all temples the upright heart and pure, instruct me, for thou knowest. Thou from the first wast present. So the Holy Spirit is the ultimate, say, muse to inspire him here. Thou from the first wast present, and with mighty wings outspread, dove-like, satst brooding on the vast abyss, and madest it pregnant. What in me is dark, illumine, and what is low, raise and support. So he's asking this muse to the muse, well, the Holy Spirit, that in the first book of Genesis, in the beginning, God created the heavens, the earth, and he did so by being this presence, this spirit over the waters, dividing them, and taking the chaos of that watery chaos, dividing it and creating sky, earth, land, etc., the 6 days of creation. So he wants that spirit to, just as the first creation in Genesis is light, let there be light, so too here in what is dark for Milton, illumine. Okay, so there's a lot going on there. What is dark for the poet is all that which is outside of normal human experience. So he wants to talk about things that happened in the dark recesses of the past, what's going to happen in the future. He wants to talk about what's happening in the realm of divine spiritual things. He's locked in kind of a box of space and time that keeps his vision and and senses to material things. So all of that needs to be illumined for him, or illuminated for him. But also on a personal level, Milton had gone blind in 1652. And the first draft of this poem was 1667. So he was working on this after he became blind, reciting it to family members, to his daughters. So much like Homer, apparently was, according to legends, was blind as well. So in that sense, what is in me dark, illumine is a reference potentially also to himself, right? His own blindness. So there's all these levels going on at once, personal autobiographical reference, kind of a general spiritual reference, the actual biblical story, allusions to classical literature, the invocations that are happening in the epics we read. All of that is happening at the same time. What is low, raise, and support? That in the height of this great argument, I may assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men. So in a way, this is remember we talked about thesis statement. This is in a way the thesis statement of this entire epic. Okay, the thesis statement is, I want to justify, in this great epic, I'm going to justify the ways of God to men. What does that mean? So sometimes, justifying the ways of God to men is kind of a short form for a type of writing that's often called Theodicy. So Theodicy comes from two Greek words. Theos is Greek for God, and the D-I-C-Y, Theodicy, so D-I-C-Y, comes from DK in Greek, D-I-K-E, which is justice. So pointing out the justice of God, okay? So Theodicy, a Theodicy has to tackle claims like, why is there suffering in the world? Why is there evil in the world? If God is great, so if God is omnipotent, omniscient, and all good, why is there evil in the world? Why would God create creatures to be so, limited, what have you? So there's a lot of these types of, formulations of the problem and formulations of the solution. So, maybe the solution is, we see, much like children, we don't see it now, but because of our limited eyesight, but in an afterlife or what have you, if we were to direct our wills in the right way, maybe we would see the right, the benevolence and the goodness behind what seems unjust to us. So that's kind of one answer. Then there's others. So in Milton's own project, he's apparently going to provide a form of justification, why it is just for God to have created humans that are going to fall, for instance, okay? So that's the first 26 lines. So if we think to our the epic predecessors we looked at, and mostly the Aeneid. So the beginning says, I want to sing of arms and the man. So the man that went and ultimately founded the predecessor of Rome. He fled from Troy, but first he had to go on many journeys, and there was a lot of suffering. Why? What caused all that? So it was Juno's anger. That's what it was. So tell me, Muse, inspire me. Tell me, what was it that caused the suffering of Aeneas before he was able to found Rome? And this starts the whole story of the Aeneid. And the next part after this invocation in the Aeneid is, oh, it was Juno's wrath. She just wouldn't. She hated Aeneas. She hated the Trojans for so many reasons, and we talked a bit about that. And that was it. And then the story starts to flow from there. So invocation, first few lines, I want to tell a story about Aeneas. Inspire me, Muse, to tell that story. I guess I need to know first about what caused some of the troubles, and then the muse inspires him to know that it was the anger of Juno. So Juno is a goddess, right, who's obviously more powerful than humans, who in a way is a perverter of human ways, so to speak. So too here we have a narrator saying, inspire me to tell a great story. Say first, that's the next line. I want to tell, in this case, I want to tell the story of all humanity and their fall. And in doing so, I want to justify the ways of God to humanity. So say first what caused this fall, and what led to our downfall, and what all our suffering, and then instead of Juno, and according to the biblical tradition, it's Satan. Okay, so say first, for heaven hides nothing from thy view, nor the deep tract of hell. Say first what cause moved our grandparents in that happy state. So so nothing hides, so nothing can be hidden from your view, muse or Holy Spirit that he was just invoking, right? Nor the deep tract of hell. So here we already know that we're going to have to look into the depths of hell to find out what this cause is. Say what first cause was. Again, very parallel to the other epics, right? What cause moved our grandparents, so Adam and Eve, in that happy state, they were in this blissful Eden, favored of heaven so highly, to fall off? Why were they were in that happy state, favored of heaven? What caused them to fall off from their creator and transgress his will? For one restraint, lords of the world besides. For other than that one rule, they had a world of choice. So one thing I want to point out too here is the way that Milton represents human choice here is kind of remarkable in relation to the Renaissance epics and Dante that he's dealing with. So Renaissance and earlier epics. So Dante, and then there's this other English poet who wrote an epic that Milton also refers to in this work, called so the English poet's called Edmund Spenser, and his epic was called The Faerie Queene. So in both Dante and the Faerie Queene, we have mazes and thick woods, and heroes find themselves there and are lost in these mazes of error. So the mazes and the woods are humanity in error. And there's one way. There's millions of paths or thousands of paths, and humanity has to pick one way. There are a number of ways to fall off the path. Temptation is around every corner, and the path is very narrow, and it's very difficult to stay on it. Milton reverses it. It's we have free choice to do so many things. And so one thing to keep, if Milton is anything, he's a poet of human liberty, so human rational liberty. So we'll try to come back to that theme as well. So human rational liberty, we are free. God gave us our reason and our free will for a divine reason, in order to be the greatest, the best, and the most spiritual beings we could be. There are a lot of ways we can do, a lot of paths we can take to pursue that, and there's only one restraint: not to veer away from a good end, a divine end. Okay, lords of the world, for one restraint, lords of the world beside. So one here in the Garden of Eden, they could have done anything. They could live forever, great fruit at the reach of their fingertips, and one tree that they were not supposed to eat from. And other than that, lords of the world. Who first seduced them to that foul revolt? The infernal serpent. He it was whose guile stirred up with envy and revenge, deceived the mother of mankind. What time his pride had cast him out from heaven, with all his host of rebel angels, by whose aid aspiring to set himself in glory above his peers, he trusted to have equaled the Most High. If he opposed, and with ambitious aim against the throne and monarchy of God, so I went through a bit of the poem there. So obviously, who was it? It was the Infernal Serpent, Satan, whose guile stirred up with envy, tempted the mother of mankind, Eve, and it was him, because of his pride, Satan, that he was cast out of heaven. So part of the myth there is that Satan and all the other was one with a host of millions of these angels, angelic beings that are one with God. This is before creation. And Satan's pride meant that he tried to revolt and tried to take over, let's say, the monarchy of heaven. And he and the other angels that sided with him, so a third of the heavenly host, were thrown out of heaven into a newly created hell. So that's the myth that Milton's building on and creates his, let's say, cosmos out of. So this is what's being referred to here, that he, to set himself in glory above his peers, he trusted to have equaled the Most High. If he opposed, and with ambitious aim against the throne and monarchy of God, raised imperious war in heaven. So in book 6, we have the description of what's being alluded to here, the war in heaven. Okay, because it's a retrospective. Here we're beginning in the middle of things. Satan's already fallen. There's going to be a retrospective of the war in heaven and what caused that fall of Satan. And then we'll have going forward to the actual fall of Adam and Eve. And battle proud with vain attempt. So vain has a couple of senses there. So vain means vain as in, there's an old 70s song, nobody probably knows it, but you're so vain, you probably think the song is about you, you're so vain. So vain there means self-centered, conceited, prideful. So the world refers to oneself. Vain can also mean pointless, so that it's going to result in nothing. So it's a vain attempt in two senses. And again, notice the word attempt. Him the almighty power hurled headlong flaming from the ethereal sky, with hideous ruin and combustion down to bottomless perdition, there to dwell in adamantine chains and penal fire, who durst defy the omnipotent to arms. Just want to look at that sentence there for a bit. This is a very typical, it's a typical Miltonic sentence, okay? So, pardon me. So, I think it was all that H alliteration that I'm about to point out that got this tickle in my throat. So the him, the almighty power, hurled headlong. So a couple things. So him, God, hurled. So not him. So him is Satan. The almighty power is God. So God hurled him, Satan, headlong, upside down and flopping all over the place, out of heaven, and falling for 9 days, we find out, into this space that was newly created called hell. Okay, but the sentence, the syntax and the wording make us, as we read it, kind of almost live and enact what Satan had to go through there. So the syntax is reversed. So him, the almighty power, hurled headlong. So instead of the almighty power hurled him headlong, it's reversed in almost like Yoda-like language there. So it's backwards, and just like Satan is kind of backwards and falling upside down. And with the H's, as you read it, you're kind of out of breath as you read it out loud. So him, the almighty power, hurled headlong, flaming in the ethereal sky with hideous ruin, so there's another H there. And adamantine chains. So in the Marvel universe, adamantium is that hardest substance, is from this old Latinate word there. Who durst defy the omnipotent to arms. 9 times the space that measures day and night to mortal men. He with his horrid crew, so horrid again, lay vanquished, rowling in the fiery gulf, confounded though immortal. But his doom reserved him to more wrath. For now the thought both of lost happiness and lasting pain torments him. So he's laying in this burning lake in hell after falling for 9 days, after losing this war in heaven that we only have a glimpse of here, and we'll learn more about it in book 6. He's laying there with his millions of compadres in this burning lake, but his doom reserved him more wrath. But there's more wrath than just the fact that he's lying there in this burning lake. For now the thought both of lost happiness and lasting pain torments him. So the hell is in the mind, right? So the hell is the torment of knowing that this will last forever, and the torment of knowing that you had something so perfect before and you lost it, right? So often, again, as I say, the descent into hell is this kind of, in literary terms, is this descent into a psychological darkness. And often, people can say they had a dark spot in their lives, and they had to turn around from that. So too here, except Satan is unredeemable, but a human can look back and say, boy, things were so dark. Look what I've lost and given up. I need to get that back. Okay, and it's from that darkness that you can see for the first time what you have or had and need to get back, or cherish what you need to hold on to. Here, the torment of hell is knowing you can't get it back. Okay, so hell is falling with no redemption. Hell is being fallen without any hope of out of your own activity or out of grace from God or the universe to be recovered from that state. Round he throws his baleful eyes that witnessed huge affliction and dismay, mixed with obdurate pride and steadfast hate. At once as far as angels can he views the dismal situation, waste and wild, a dungeon horrible on all sides round, as one great furnace flamed, yet from those flames no light, but rather darkness visible, served only to discover sights of woe, regions of sorrow, doleful shades where peace and rest can never dwell. Hope never comes that comes to all, but torture without end still urges, and a fiery deluge fed with ever-burning sulfur unconsumed. So I'll just stop there. So he looks around with his baleful eyes. He's got these, big, sorrowful eyes, and he's looking around and he sees sights of the pain mixed with anger and pride of himself, but also of his peers who fell with him. And then this notion of darkness visible that I mentioned, right? Regions of sorrow, and again, this notion of no hope coming. Why? Everything about the description shows you why there's no hope coming. If you're saying that it's really hot, well, it might cool down later, maybe, well, that's burning really hot now, but soon that sulfur's got to burn out and it's going to cool down. No, the sulfur, that is this ever-burning sulfur, is unconsumed. It's been created to eternally burn, so to speak. Such place eternal justice had prepared for those rebellious. Here their prison ordained in utter darkness, and their portion set as far removed from God and light of heaven as from the center thrice to the utmost pole. I won't go into that now, but it's just picture of how far the earth is from heaven in Milton's cosmos to how far hell is under kind of a chaos underneath the earth. Oh, how unlike the place from whence they fell. There the companions of his fall, o'erwhelmed with floods and whirlwinds of tempestuous fire, he soon discerns, and weltering by his side, one next himself in power and next in crime, long after known in Palestine and named Beelzebub, to whom the archenemy, and thence in heaven called Satan, with bold words breaking the horrid silence, thus began. So we then get, I'll stop there, but we then get Satan's first speech. Okay, so that's the opening of Paradise Lost. I'm gonna go back to so we go back to this the slide show with our points there. So we talked about the invocation. We looked at the opening lines, and he's building on this epic tradition. He's doing it in a way that also points to biblical tradition as some way providing a divine truth that transcends the limited truths of classical literature, according to Milton. We didn't read it, but there's, if you look at introductory matter, so on the side is, where on the site we were, there's, index, you can go to book 1, book 2, and there's also introductory matter. At the bottom of that is something Milton wrote called the verse, and it's a description of the verse. He describes that he's using blank verse, so it's unrhymed iambic pentameter. Okay, so there's five iambs, so 5 stressed combinations of unstressed stressed syllables, generally in a line of unrhymed lines. And he says that this is heroic verse, that this is what Homer and Virgil used. So for him, the epic tradition is defined by the type of language it used right off the bat. First of all, that's what he points to. And the language of epic is simile. Remember the similes that we've talked about in Homer and Virgil. And so all epic similes are expansive, but I want to make the point that Milton's epic similes are expansive, are more expansive. He takes epic similes to a whole new level, right? So what he does is try to take, for a lot of the epic similes, you'll see that the simile will pull from classical tradition. It'll trump that with biblical tradition. It'll say how maybe an example where we can see that in our own, let's say, contemporary experience. And then in this example, and in some examples, the epic simile is so expansive we can have a simile within a simile. So I'll just point that out in these lines. This is also from book 1, a little bit later than where we read. So he's just had his speech with Beelzebub, and they're about to try to get themselves off the lake to the shore where it's only burning land instead of burning lake, so don't worry, it'll be better over there, it'll be that, it looks nicer over there in that part of hell. Thus Satan, talking to his nearest mate, with head uplift above the wave, and eyes that sparkling blazed, his other parts besides, prone on the flood, extended long and large, lay floating many a rood, in bulk as huge as whom the fables name of monstrous size, Titanian or earthborn that warred on Jove, Briareos or Typhoon, whom the den by ancient Tarsus held, or that sea beast Leviathan, which God of all his works created hugest that swim the ocean stream, him haply slumbering on the Norway's foam, the pilot of some small night-foundered skiff, deeming some island oft as seamen tell, were fixed anchor in his scaly rind, moors by his side under the lee, while night invests the sea and wished morn delays. So stretched out huge in length, the arch fiend lay, and chained on burning lake. So this is an epic simile. I'll just highlight where it starts happening. So as huge as, so that's the first part of it. Okay, so you know how it's usually just as this, just as blah, 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 and then a long expansive description. Just so was this person, you know, so just as a mountain that shoots Etna, that shoots volcanic fire, so just as that, so too was the wrath of Turnus as he went, you know, in that battle in book 12 of the Aeneid. Here, the just as is about the bulk of Satan. So it's a simile about, let's say, the incredible size of Satan and how long and large he is prone on this, with his wings extended all over the place on this burning lake. So trying to give us, let's say, an image. But it's not an image that we can really wrap our heads around, because they're these mythical creatures that don't necessarily have a size with respect to human understanding at first. Okay, so the first one is in bulk as huge as, whom the fables name of monstrous size. So the fables of, or the Greek myths of the Titans battling Jove or Zeus, and Briareos, like the Hecatonchires, these hundred-handed ones, and Typhon, another one, who are held in caves, or so just as them, or as the sea beast Leviathan. So the first one was to classical Greek literature, or the sea beast Leviathan, which is referenced in Job, in Psalms, and Isaiah, and is this huge beast of the sea, which God of all his work created hugest that swim the ocean stream. And then him, so Leviathan in a way is compared to, in the next part, a whale that that a whale that in kind of folklore of contemporary sailors, sailors mistakenly would anchor their small vessels to. So according to these folklores of sailors, of maybe kind of legends or exaggerations of sailors, they would say, okay, well, yeah, there's whale was so big, it was night, it was kind of wavy, we tried to find this island, it was a small island, we kind of set anchor there, little did we know that it was actually a whale, it took off, you know. So here we have Satan being compared to Greek mythological titans, as huge as them, or to biblical creatures as Leviathan. And Leviathan as a sea beast is like a whale that we kind of, sailors that you know of, maybe they, you know, set their anchors to and are deceived by that. So a couple of things. First of all, Satan then is compared to creatures that are mythologically huge, large, rebellious. Okay, so they represent chaos. Leviathan represents a kind of a primordial chaos that has to be slayed by the kind of like the primordial act of creation is dividing the waters. So the waters are like Leviathan, this huge, deep abyss that must be given a certain order. So they represent chaos. They represent like the Titans, kind of and the hundred-handed one's revolting against Zeus's rule, or in this case against God's rule. And in that third example, they're deceptive. So Satan is also deceptive. Okay, so a lot going on in the simile. It's basically what I want to say. So here we have a breakdown of the story. So remember we talked about the difference between the story order and narrative order. So there's narrative, the way, let's say, the ordering of the way the story is told. And then there's the story as it develops in terms of its chronology. So here is a chronological breakdown of what happens. So the first thing that happens in time, so to speak, is Satan's rebellion, but we don't hear about that until, in terms of the narrative, until book 5. So the beginning of time begins with, so before that, there was really no time. It was just this eternal bliss of angels reflecting God's goodness. And then things begin, the story begins with Satan rebelling and bringing down a host of angels. Then there's a war in heaven, which is described in book 6. Then there's creation. God creates the earth and the cosmos. That's described in book 7. There's the awakening of the fallen angels. So that's described in book 1, and we just looked at a couple passages of that. There's the consultation in hell, which happens in book 2. So they get up, they awake from the fallen, from being fallen into this burning lake. The fallen angels do, and they say, okay, well, we got to get our act together. What are we going to do? So they build Pandemonium, this huge council hall, to discuss and debate their future efforts and what would make the most sense. And that's depicted in book 2. Then we are shown heaven, which is one of the most unique things in literature, is this trying to describe heavenly figures consulting one another. Then book 4, this is the next event, let's say story-wise, is Satan arrives in paradise. The result of the consultation is in hell is, they're saying, should we try to assault heaven again? What should we do? And they just said, well, I heard that there's been this new world created, and that maybe we could go and destroy that and maybe take over that world. And so Satan is sent off on this kind of conquering mission or colonizing mission to take over this new world, kind of, as I said, akin to the mission of a colonizer. And he arrives in paradise, the Garden of Eden, in book 4. Okay, so book 4 is our first window onto Adam and Eve, and we see Adam and Eve through the eyes of Satan. Okay, because we're fallen, that we can't really experience Adam and Eve really from unfallen eyes. God then sends Raphael to Adam, and Raphael, an archangel, describes or reveals cosmic history to Adam. Okay, so you're probably confused. There was Satan was coming around. You had a bad dream and everything because Satan was here. But here's what's going on. So there was this happened. There was a big fight upstairs. And then all those guys got kicked out, and then you guys were created. And now he's here, but just do the right thing, okay? So that's basically book 5. And then we have, in terms of story order, the fall of Eve, Adam and Eve, which is described in book 9. We have the consequences of the fall. So they begin fighting one another. They have to come to terms with it and resolve to fall and prostrate and beg for mercy. And probably, I would say, one of the overall moral messages of the poem is this is the act of heroism, is kind of submission and asking for forgiveness, and trying to, they get to a point where Adam and Eve are saying, well, let's stop blaming one another, and let's try to get through this loving one another. Let's try to salve each other's wounds. Let's try to help each other. And that's kind of, I think, the ultimate message of the poem. So, and then we have cosmic future revealed. The archangel Michael comes down to give hope and a sense of the future, that this fall will be redeemed in the form of Christ and a future redemption of humanity. So that's kind of the overall picture of what happens in the epic. I'll start here. That was our preliminaries. That was a good sense of, let's say, an overview of what happens in the epic. We looked at the first lines of the epic to get a sense of the language, what he's doing with similes, how he's relating to previous epics. And now I just want to touch a little bit on the context in which this poem was written, a little bit on Milton's life. So we might be able to, in addition to these biblical and classical references, there's these immediate political context that's happening with Milton. So the biggest, I would say the biggest factor to keep in mind in terms of historical context is living in the shadow of this civil war in England. Okay, so Charles the First reigned in that period that you see there, 1625 to 49, and there was growing tension with Parliament. Okay, so it wasn't this kind of constitutional monarchy as we understand it at the time, right? So the king had substantial powers over Parliament, you know. So there's a tension at the time with each asserting its power. It leads to a civil war from 42 to 49, and the parliamentary forces ultimately defeat the royalist forces, and Charles I is executed. And then there, for a short time period, there was a commonwealth, so a republic in England for a number of years. So there's no absolute ruler, no monarch, and considerable religious freedom, considerable freedom of publication, these types of things that were not experienced before. And then we have a protectorate under Oliver Cromwell, so a bit of a kind of a despotism, still not technically a monarchy, but maybe some republican liberties lost. And then a restoration, so forces, royalist forces are able to arrange a restoration of Charles's son with limitations on the power of the monarch, as Charles II in 1660. So Milton's a stout supporter of this Republican cause, and was a member of this Republican government. Okay, so a fairly high-ranking member. So I like to think of, if we look at the Virgil's Aeneid, how it was written in the context of over 100 years of unending civil strife, and it was basically kind of seeing Augustan rule, which we look at as the beginning of empire and of absolute rule by one man. But he saw it. You could make a case that he saw it as the return to republican liberty and to the pious ways of the ancestors and that type of thing. So that case could be made. But in any case, he saw it as a, let's say, the positive outcome of that civil war. So Milton also writing at the end of a period of civil war, but I think you'd have to say that his is a celebration less of the monarchy that ended up winning, but of a celebration of divine rule that allows us a higher liberty. Okay, so one way to think about it is the sense that political struggles for liberty are lost. Politics is lost, save your soul, so to speak. I think if I were to maybe sum it up. So a little bit about his life. I'm going to go very quickly over this. So he, even from a young age, he had this mission to in this sense that he's going to be the great English poet and write a great English epic. So obviously this notion of writing an English epic, we have to think about how it was modified. So rather than writing of King Arthur and of the founding of England as a national identity, following Edmund Spenser's, that's what Edmund Spenser's epic is about. We have an epic that is not at all about that and doesn't mention England. So there's new senses of heroism, this kind of universal sense of humanity, of cosmic history rather than national history. So I mentioned a tense period of study where he needed to try to learn everything he could. He had a period of writing his early poems. This 1642 to 1660 is this, what we could call a polemical prose period. He's writing to support the Republican causes, writing a lot of pamphlets, writing other tracts in prose in support of different issues, critiquing, elaborate church government, pro-divorce, on education, on the proper kind of what you need to teach an educated, free people, Okay, so that's very important. If you believe that it's important for everyone to exercise their freedom, for him, education is super important. Less so if you're a person who feels that there's one divine ruler and that everyone should just align themselves to their own individual choices are less important than just do your job, right? So if you have this belief in personal liberty, then education's important. Freedom of press or publication, not necessarily journalistic press, but freedom of publication, because there had been periods of censoring of the press in terms of what books could get published depending on their topics. So the first real defense of free speech, really, in Areopagitica, I really strongly recommend. If you read anything of John Milton's prose, it's still a work that's referred to in discussions of free speech. A defense of regicide after they killed Charles I, and other tracts on republicanism. So as I said, he served in the government as secretary for a fairly high post, goes blind in 52, I mentioned, and maybe we have a new notion of heroism, again, in this notion of the fact that Satan is the one who's presented in the garb of a traditional martial hero, the one with a shield, with a huge spear. He's the one who acts, has great, powerful speeches. Maybe so we're tempted to see Satan as the hero. He's the first one we see. He's the one, as I said, undertaking these bold actions and rousing troops, just like when we first see Aeneas in the Aeneid. It's very similar. He's rousing the troops after a storm. Here, they're flailing on the lake. Satan's got to rouse them, just like Aeneas does. There's echoes of it, echoes of the language of Aeneas rousing his troops. Okay, so there's an element there where the reader wants to see Satan as a hero. I would say we ultimately see a new version of heroism as we unfold in the poem. We're tempted to see that at the beginning, but then we ultimately get to a point where we see that as a fallen perspective. We see that the real heroism is maybe of Eve, and Eve, first of all, she's the one who first does it and says, I'm sorry, we're fighting, basically, and submits and says, I'm sorry, let's stop, let's salve each other's wounds. That is heroism, being able to swallow your pride. That takes guts. I don't know if you've, I think about, it's a poem about Adam and Eve, like this married couple that have the worst fight of all time after the worst mix up and the worst screw up of all time. So you think you got into a fight with your partner or loved one after they dinged your car that they were borrowing or something. Well, how about after you've both fallen and been kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and or are being kicked out of the Garden of Eden because you screwed up and ate this forbidden fruit? So that started the kind of the mother of all, say, relationship problems. So in those fights, I don't know, if you've had a fight with a partner or a loved one, I find, there's pride sets in my own experience. You get there and you go, back of your mind, you're thinking, we've got to get to a point where we're going to say, sorry, this is silly, whatever, what are we even fighting about? You kind of know what we've got to reach that point, but there's this pride that says, but it's not me. I'm not saying I'm sorry. They hurt me and my feelings. They hurt me. It's about me, right? And why was I not given the due that I'm deserved? And why did she do that? Or why did he say that? And that type of thing. And heroism, as opposed to self-assertion in the poem, ends up being this kind of giving up of that, the prideful me, and saying, let's try to turn towards one another, and let's try to undertake a loving relationship. So I want to talk a bit about, I've alluded to it already, but uh, some of the different ways in which this poem's been interpreted. Okay, so the just because it's going to help guide us on kind of the critical paths that we need to go down. And the main lens I'm going to take here in terms of the critical reception is the Satan question. Okay, because there obviously there have been a lot of different interpretations about different elements of the poem, but the main axis that can kind of align a lot of these is the question around how do we interpret Satan as in these poems, and what's the role, and what are we supposed to get out of that, and the relationship to God, let's say. So in the 18th century, and immediately after it was published in the late 17th century, there was a sense that maybe Milton renounced his former republicanism, his republican politics, because the republican viewpoint seems to be that expressed by Satan. Okay, and then the Romantic period, so the end of the 18th century, early 19th century, there's a growing recognition of, well, first of all, growing notion that of Milton's place in the English canon. So Coleridge claimed that he sat with Shakespeare on, quote, one of the two glory-smitten summits of the poetic mountain. So pretty high, him along with Shakespeare as the two summits of English literature. And also a growing sense of Satan as maybe the hero of the poem. So Milton wrote, and this is quoted also in your essay topics, right? The reason Milton wrote in feathers when he wrote of angels and God, and at liberty when of devils and hell, is because he was a true poet and of the devil's party without knowing it. And on the right, we have one of, Blake has a number of these. Blake was a poet and a visual artist. Check him out if you get a chance. It's just absolutely unique in the history of literature, how his method for creating these prints, where he called it his diabolical method, where he would etch things out through acid, and then the acid would etch away what the surface that would then put the ink on. So he called it this reverse method of writing. So sorry, I'm going the wrong way here. And then in the 20th century, we have an oscillation, let us say, between what I call an orthodox Milton, represented by figures like C.S. Lewis. So C.S. Lewis wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. He has a number of works on Christian theology, or Christian spirituality, more precisely, but is also a literary critic in addition to all that, and he has a number of great books on how to interpret medieval literature and Renaissance literature. And one of these is on, I think it's called A Preface to Paradise Lost. So C.S. Lewis's interpretation is that this is an orthodox poem. It's about trying to guide us to God, and you're fooled. It's only a limited perspective that sees Satan as heroic. Okay, and then there on the other side we have critics like William Empson and a number of others on both sides but on the satanic side, the question is to say, well, no, if I'm supposed to see this as guiding me to God, why is the only exciting part of the poem, and part of the poem that I want to read and reread are books 1 and 2 with Satan in it, giving great speeches, and the flowery language, and the ornate imagery. So that's kind of the satanic position. I think a brilliant book, one of those books, Surprised by Sin by Stanley Fish, I think 68 or 69, I want to say that it was published. One of those great books that of literary criticism that will, stands the test of time. And he in a way accommodates both perspectives and tries to, makes the ambiguity about Satan part of the design. So and what I'm going to describe is largely a Fish kind of reading. if I can say that without sounding confusing, it is largely an interpretation guided by fish. There'll be other elements that I refer to that are not strictly in line with fish, but generally this notion that we're tempted by Satan, and that's part of the design. We're tempted as readers to identify with Satan, but that's part of Milton's design to educate us as readers to see that temptation. So early on in books 1 and 2, we're tempted to sympathize with him, and then later on we see that temptation was hollow. Okay, I'm going to stop there tonight. So we've had basically a good introduction to book 1, not all of book 1, but to the context, to the epic invocation, to the language. We've had a bit of the background of historical context of Milton's life and his Republican politics. We've talked about the history of interpretation along this main axis of what are we to do with this figure of Satan. And we'll go into that in a bit more detail next week when we'll talk about books 1 and 2 in greater detail. So do read at least books 1 and 2 for next week. Thank you very much. Have a good week.